So, so people probably have different levels of knowledge. Again, I was just thinking of doing something on the basic Jewish books. It's an interesting question. Generally, what do we consider the most fundamental Jewish book? By the way, if I asked you that, what would you say? Yeah.
The Torah.
Okay, Torah, meaning, I guess.
The 5 books.
Okay, it's a great answer. Does everybody agree? Anybody disagree? Anybody have a thought? I would actually argue, believe it or not, that it's not. I mean, I'm not saying it's not important, but that in many ways the Talmud is more central, because I don't think you could be a Jew from the 5 books of Moses, right? The Torah says many things that we would not really know what they mean. Build a sukkah, the sign on your eyes. There's many things that the Torah has a lot of details about, the Mishkan, the tabernacle. There's so much that the Torah doesn't have any detail about. It's very hard to be a Jew. Besides that, there are things that might throw you off from what we consider Judaism, like an eye for an eye, that sort of thing. Right? How to keep Judaism, you really wouldn't know from the Torah. Jews really are not the religion. I mean, I know this sounds crazy, but in a way, Jews really are not the religion of the Bible. Jews really are the religion of the Talmud. I don't mean that Torah is not important. It is important. But the Torah itself would not be enough to know how to practice Judaism, whereas the Talmud might. Now, Maimonides, actually, in his introduction to his book of Jewish law, the Mishnah Torah, he writes that he's writing up basically all of Torah Shabbal Peh, all of the oral tradition, and that all you need is the written tradition, Torah itself, Chad mentioned, and that for the oral tradition, all you're going to need is the Mishnah Torah, his book of Jewish law. And he seems to think that those 2 books would be enough. And now that was an act, you could say there's a lot of audacity there. On the other hand, he was the first person to really create a book of Jewish law, to really summarize how to do Judaism in a book. Okay. Is there a consensus on the Karaites? Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. So the Karaites were not the first group that rejected the oral tradition. The Sadducees in the time of the Gemara was a similar group. And you see in the Talmud itself that there were, the rabbis of the Talmud considered the Sadducees to be, a heresy, although they did at times run the temple. Sometimes the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, was a Sadducee. There's even the story in the Gemara where instead of pouring the water on the altar on Sukkot, poured it on the ground on his feet, because he thought that that's what the Torah meant. And that that was a sign that he was a Sadducee, and everybody pelted him with their etrogim. I think killed him. There were certain things that were known, obviously, the Sadducees did, like they took literally counting the Omer from Sunday, because it says in the day after the Shabbat. But we understand that to be the second day of Sukkot. So, Sadducees very famously, or Karaites very famously, did not have a light or heat in their house on Shabbos, because the Torah says don't kindle a fire on it. Lo tavaru esh. So does that mean kindle a fire, or does that mean have a fire burning? So they understood it very literally. So you could end up being more strict as a Karaite, or less strict. But you're right. I'm not sure that they could really live any kind of Judaism without any kind of oral tradition. I think it's just there. You have the Samaritans today. They're a group that lives in Israel, in the Shomron, near Nablus, near Shechem. And, they say they've been there for thousands of years. They've been there for thousands of years. And they have a Torah written in ancient Hebrew script, actually at the Bible Museum. See one of their Torahs. And they say that they're doing what you should do as a Jew. They bring a Passover offering, but it's on Pesach Sheni. It's on a month after the regular Passover. They still bring it. They don't bring it in Jerusalem. They bring it on Mount Gerizim. This state of the West Bank. So, who are the, you have, obviously, in many ways, Christians were, another version of Judaism. That's what it was. It became, its own thing over time, but those were Jews. And the, okay. So let me pull up some books, because you'll probably hear about certain books, and maybe I'll sort of pull up what it looks like, the traditional format. So I'm going to use Hebrew books. This is a website of which everything's in Hebrew, but it's free, and you can easily see things. So I'm going to put in a title called Mikraot Gedola. Okay. So this is a so obviously you have the Chumash, you have the 5 books of Moses, and then you have many commentaries on it, right? Who's the most famous commentary? This, yeah.
Rashi,
right? So right, in many ways, it'd be hard to read the Torah without Rashi. I actually just saw, so the Mikraot Gedolot means many sources, and it was the first time that a Chumash was printed. This is early at the beginning of printing, late 14, early 1500s. Started printing a Chumash, and they printed it with Rashi. Chumash, by the way, you know what Chumash means, everybody? Chumash comes from the Hebrew word chamisha, 5. Yeah, 8. Right, you can yell it out if I can't see it. What's Chumash?
5.
What? Right, you can yell it out.
It's like for the five books of Moses. 5.
Exactly, 5 books of Moses, right? So why is it called Chumash? But if you ask somebody in shul, I need a Chumash, you're going to get you one of those red or blue Bibles that has Genesis to Deuteronomy, Rashid to Devarim. Why is it called a Chumash? Because it comes from the word Chamisha, Chamesh, 5, the 5 books. Now, if we say Tanakh, that's a little bit different, right? Tanakh is an acronym for Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim, which includes not only the Torah, the 5 books, but also the prophets, the Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim, the writings. So here we have a Mikraot Gedolot. This one happened to have been published in New York in 1971. And you can see it says in Perushim with commentaries, V'hosafot Rabot, many editions. Page. It'll have the introductions. So here it lists all the commentaries. If a person wants a Chumash, wants a Bible with a lot of commentary, this is sort of the most basic version. And many of these you'll find on Safari translation, but it has Targum, which is let's actually look at it. These are introductions. This is the introduction of the Ibn Ezra. He was a Sephardic commentary, very, very basic commentary. In fact, this early Mikraot Gedolot from the very early 1500s that I just saw in the Bible Museum had only 2 commentaries. What did it have? It had Rashi and the Ibn Ezra, because those are the ones. Ibn Ezra talks a lot about words, how to translate certain words. Rashi, of course, is bothered by the basic things that might bother you in a verse, the juxtaposition of different verses, a word that seems like the wrong word to be used. So Rashi and Ibn Ezra, you could say, are the most basic commentaries because you can't even sort of read the Torah with them. And so those were the 2 that I saw printed in a very early Mikraot Gedolot, which means a chumash with commentary. The other day, if you haven't been to the Bible Museum, let's go. It's really, there's just, you could spend days and days and days there. There's actually an Orthodox guy, he's a sofer. He is there writing a Torah all day. And if you talk to him, he'll give you a lot of information. The day when it's slow, he'll give you a little work. It's really, okay. So we have here, this is, of course, the beginning of the Torah, Bereshit bara, in the beginning God created. Right, so here you have one line, and it sort of reminds you a little bit of the Talmud, where you have one line and then a lot of commentary. And now this is in Rashi Script. This is sometimes called Rashi Script. Rashi didn't invent this. It was just another font, but it's a little bit harder to read than regular block printing. This, for instance, is in regular Hebrew block printing. It's Ramban, not Maimonides. But if you go to these commentaries, Rashi, Ibn Ezra, these are in what's called Rashi Script. They're slightly different. The same Hebrew language, same words, but it's just a different font. It's a little harder to read. Why did they do it? In order to, either it was easier to print or it was to separate between different commentaries on the page. So here you have one line of the Torah, first line of the Torah. And then on the side here, you have something called Onkelos. Right? What is Onkelos? So Onkelos is it's a Targum, which means a translation, but it's a translation into Aramaic. And it's the translation that the Jewish people used when they lived in Babylonia. And in fact, the Talmud's very clear that the way it was done is the person reading the Torah would read one line, and then there would be a translator, because people didn't have printed books. But they also didn't necessarily understand Hebrew. They understood their vernacular language, which was Babylonian, Aramaic, that the Jews spoke. And so the reader of the Torah would read one line, and then the person standing next to them, the translator, would translate that line into Aramaic. Now, we don't do this anymore. But Yemenite Jews still do this. You go to a Yemenite synagogue, let's say in Israel, they will read, Bereshit bara Elokim et hashmayim v'haaretz, and then somebody will translate it into Aramaic. Kadmin bara Hashem yat shmaya v'yatar. Even though I don't know how many Yemenites really probably don't speak, very few people speak Aramaic anymore. There are actually non-Jews who speak Syriac, which is Aramaic. But they have that tradition left over from the time of Talmud. So we have, obviously what we have is English translations. We don't read it out loud, but we have books, obviously. So okay, then we have Rashi right here. And then this was a later commentary on Rashi. It's, I think, very early 1800s. You have the Ibn Ezra, who I mentioned, Rabbi Moshe, son of Ezra, the Sephardic rabbi who lived in the medieval period. Then you have Nachmanides, the Ramban, Moshe ben Nachman. He lived 50 years after Maimonides, so we're talking about the 1200s. These are all commentaries on this one verse of "In the beginning, God created the earth." Sepharno, who's also Sephardic. Many of the commentaries on the Bible, on the Torah, are Sephardic. This is a super commentary on this. Commentary, just like this, is a commentary. Let's look at the next page. There's some other commentaries. Sometimes the commentaries take so much space to spread them out in pages. So, for instance, here's you don't even have a verse here. You have two other translations. Some of these Aramaic translations are not direct translations. They add. Here's a translation called Targum Yerushalmi, translation of the Jerusalem translation. And it actually says with wisdom. Here the Baal HaTurim, this is another commentary. You have a continuation of Rashi and this commentary on Rashi. And then you have two other commentaries here on the bottom. The Or HaChaim, Rabbi Atiyah, who lived in the 1700s. The Klei Yakar, who's later. And then there's so much commentary here that you don't even have a verse of the Torah. And then on the third page, you still don't have a verse and text. You still have continuation of commentary. Now, obviously, on the first line of the Torah, there is a lot of commentary. More than you have to go here to 7 in. This is still the Orach Chaim on the first verse of the Torah. Tremendous amount of commentary. Okay, here's verse number 2, page 10. Verse number 2, 3, and 4. Again, Onkelos, the Aramaic commentary. Rashi, who we know, Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchak, who lived in the 11th century in France. Commentary on Rashi, or Chaim, and the Klayakar. We'll see exactly what they work. And then that's how this book will continue. But sometimes when you think about, what's a very basic classic book of Chumash with commentary, this is usually the Mikro Gedolot. Today, some of these are translated, not all of them. There are versions of Mikro Gedolot in which, by the way, Mikra means readings or sources. And Gedolot means you can buy one of these. It's published where everything's in block writing instead of in Rashi Script. Let's see who the player was. Him? Yeah.
Here's a question, Rabbi.
Yeah,
Why for many, many years have they always kept it in Rashi Script? Like, what is the advantage to doing that versus putting it in block script?
That's a good question. I mean, today there are versions of the Mikra Gedolot that are not in Rashi Script. Why we kept it that way? I think because you have to remember, paper was extremely valuable. So much so that a blank piece of paper you couldn't touch on Shabbat because it was considered like something you would never touch except for writing. It was so valuable. So, people wrote. I mean, the reason that the Talmud and these things are shaped the way they are is because people would write in the margins of books, and that's how it ended up being printed. Paper was very, very expensive and hard to make. And so I think that partly if you cram things together, you want them in slightly different fonts. And I'm guessing that's why. What the history of Rashi is. Now, obviously, before Rashi lived, before the 10th century, it wasn't Rashi. He picked up a Chumash. Now, obviously, till a certain point, things were only written in scrolls. Now, the scroll of the Torah doesn't have any punctuation. It doesn't have any vowels. It doesn't have any trope, which is these little markings that tell you how to read it, what the tune is, right? When you read the Torah from a scroll, it has a tune. How do you know what the tune is? The answer is these little marks here. It's in a Chumash, you have vowels, the dots, and you have these little, what's called trope markings on the bottom here. And some are on the top of a letter of the word, some on the bottom here. On this one, you can see there's 2 marks that go up. Here's 2 dots, and that's because there's no punctuation. These are tune marks, but they act as punctuation. There was a certain point at which, in the early medieval period, people started writing codices, a codex, which was in book form, the Torah in book form, which looked like this. It had vowels and marks. There was a very famous one, the Aleppo Codex, which was in a very big Jewish city called Aleppo, Syria. Eventually, Aleppo was destroyed, and the Jews were killed there. But the Aleppo Codex was pretty much lost. Though there's actually a book, a historical novel about the Aleppo Codex. Well, might even not be my novel, true, based on research. But the Aleppo Codex was, according to Maimonides, the most accurate written down version of the Torah with notes and vowels. Because you don't know from the Torah where the commas are, where the periods are. It's not in the Torah. You have to have a tradition. That tradition was handed down orally by a certain family throughout the early Middle Ages, and even earlier than that, in the Gaonic period. But then it was written down in these codices. There were many codices, and actually, if you want to see some of them, again, you can go to Bible. Some of that they purchased, they owned very early, 1200. Okay, so that's the basics of the Tanakh. So let's see when this comes. Play a car. Here we go. Pretty early, right? So Rabbi Ephraim ben Aaron launched it, 1550 to 1619. Where did he live? It was in Lublin. So that was one of the things we saw. We also saw the Rachaim. Yes. Chaim ben Attar. And he lived late 60s, early 1700s. He was a Kabbalist. He was in Morocco. They say that the Baal Shem Tov, or Bishop Baal Shem Tov, said that if he and Rabbi Chaim ben Attar would have met, the Messiah would have come. He never met them. It was considered very. Some people even append the word holy to when they refer to him. He's very. Rashi. As we said, is Rashi, see that 5, France. And he wrote a commentary not on Mash, but also on Tanakh. Now, you'll find in Mikraot Gedolot on Tanakh, also on Navi, prophets, and also on the writings. And you'll find, Rashi and those books. Same thing. Any questions about the Torah Bible? Basics of it.
This is maybe a dumb question, but just to clarify, this is part of the Tanakh.
Yes, so Tanakh is an acronym. Tough. Here, let's pull it up. So if in Hebrew you spell Tanakh, Ta, right? Tough, Nun. Right, so Tanakh brings up Hebrew Bible, and but Tanakh is it's an acronym. Right? The Taf here is Torah. That's the 5 books of Moses. The Nun is Nevi'im, prophets, and this it's a final Chaf, but a Chaf is Ketuvim, the writings. Let's see. Here's here. List of them. That's right. So yeah, this is. So right here you have. So here you have right Bereshit, Shemot, Vayikra, Bamberg, the 5 books of Moses. Can you guys see this? Yeah. Okay. Then you have the Nevi'im, the prophets. The right Yehoshua, Joshua, that's the first book of the prophets. Judges, Shmuel, about Samuel, and about he's a prophet, but in that is David, Solomon, other kings, Jeremiah, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, right? Those are the prophets. And then you have minor prophets. Those are part of the Nevi'im, part of the prophets. And then you have the Ketuvim, the writings. So those are not books of the prophets. They might have been written with what's called Ruach HaKodesh, divine inspiration. But the Talmud talks about what was going to be canonized. It wasn't clear there's certain books that there's an argument in the Talmud whether they should be part of our canon, part of the Tanakh. Were they written with Ruach HaKodesh, with divine inspiration? So for instance, there's an argument about the Song of Songs. There's an argument about Kohelet, Ecclesiastes. Should those be part of the Tanakh? It's an argument in the Talmud. These obviously did anything. So although they're not specifically books of prophets, they were written in a prophetic way, but they're more general, right? So Psalms, we assume written by David and Solomon, Proverbs, Job, Shir Hashim, Songs, Ruth, Lamentations. The 5 Megillot are part of this, so 5 Megillas. So 5 Megillas are the Megillah of Esther, see it right here, Megillah of Kohelet, Ecclesiastes, which we read on Sukkot, on the Shabbat of Sukkot, Song of Songs, which we read on the Shabbat of Passover, the Book of Ruth, which we read on Shavuot. Ruth is a convert, and Shavuot all converts, and Lamentations, Eicha, which we read on Tisha B'Av, very sad day. There's a tradition that Eicha was written by Yirmiyahu, Jeremiah, the prophet of destruction. So if you Google Tanakh, even if you Google it in English, I'm sure this will come up. Yeah, you can see it in Hebrew and English. Oh, this is very nice. Oh, here we can see all this. So right here, Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim, Chem. Ezra and Nehemiah were prophets. Simple question. Daniel was also a prophet. Esther was also a prophet. Talmud says there were 7 prophetesses. Esther was one. The latest prophets was Ezra. They prophesied the coming back of the Jewish people. They brought the Jewish people back in the year 580. First temple was destroyed in 583, 586, and then 7 years later. Destroyed the years. And then if you click on any of these, it actually shows in English. I think I'll show you Rashi. It's simple. It's just Rashi. Some of them are Rashi. Same with Safari. Any questions?
I actually have a question. When we're reading the Torah in Shul, why do you stop in the middle for the Mishaberech? Why is it in the middle of the Torah reading?
Yeah, that's a good question. It doesn't have to be. It could be at the end. There's certain things that we do at the Torah reading because it guarantees there's a minute. So that was a time when you had to have a minute to read the Torah. So for instance, people say Birkat HaGomel was a prayer that people, a blessing people say if their life was in danger and they were saved. They'll sometimes come up there, or even just from where they're sitting, they'll say that. That's usually said. It doesn't have to be said during the Torah service, but because it's usually said at the minyan, the tradition was say during the Torah service. Yeah, it doesn't have to be. It works out a little bit easier just aesthetically because at the end of the Torah reading, they want people to roll up the Torah. It doesn't have to be Mishaberach. Now, people who get called up, we say a Mishaberach for them, prayer for them, families, and usually, put some money as part of the charity. But the prayer for the sick, it could be anything. Some people are listening. Any other questions?
Yeah, I have a question. This is something I was wondering about. So the Torah was given on Mount Sinai, an event which is itself described in the Torah. But
Yeah.
the narrative of the Torah continues beyond that. So doesn't
Yes.
it imply that they could just read their own future? Moses could read the details
Yeah.
of the
Right. If Moshe knew he was going to hit the rock, don't hit the rock.
Exactly.
Very cool. Yeah. So the Talmud says that actually there's an argument about whether it was all given at Sinai or whether Megillot to Megillot did, or whether it was given throughout the travel in the desert. In other words, perhaps the laws were given at Sinai, but the narrative parts were written down as they happened. Or maybe it was all written at the end. You don't see Moshe writing a Torah until you get to the end of the Torah. Barim, God tells him, Kitvu lachem et hashira, write the Torah, and he has him write one for the Levites and one for each tribe. You sort of see that. So yeah, there's an argument in the Talmud itself how it was given, and it's interesting. What was. You have a statement in the Talmud that says everything that will ever be said about the Torah was given at Mount Sinai. Everything that a good student will come up with is given at Mount Sinai. But you also have a story in the Talmud about Moshe being in the classroom of Rabbi Akiva and not knowing what's going on. So it can't be it was given at Mount Sinai, or he would know what's going on. So, the way I've always seen it is that the general rules of how to understand Jewish law were given at Mount Sinai. And obviously, at some level, the laws were given at Mount Sinai. And now, were any other laws given in the desert, right? Were actually, the Talmud says that there were other places where law was given. So at Marah, early on, when the Jews first come out before they get to Mount Sinai, it seems that there was some law given. Moshe already talks about Shabbat there. And in Arvot Moab, on the plains of Moab, right before the Jews enter the land of Israel, it says they were given a lot of law. So it's an interesting question. What was given at Mount Sinai? Everything given at Mount Sinai? The Talmud does say that place, in some other places. But you also see the opposite. That maybe Ten Commandments were given at Sinai. If you read the Torah itself in order and you take it at face value, you would think what was given at Mount Sinai was how to build the tabernacle. We're reading that right now in Shemot. He goes up on the mountain. Right, you have Yitro, which is standing at Mount Sinai. Then in Mishpatim, the next Torah portion that we read 2 weeks ago, you have in Yitro you have God saying the things, but you don't have Moshe coming down with the tablets yet. That happens later. Moshe, but then we have Mishpatim. Well, Moshe still seems to have not gone up yet on the mountain, and that's a whole Torah portion of law, a lot of civil law, for instance, that we read 2 weeks ago. Then at the end of that Torah portion, Moshe goes up on the mountain, and then you have Truma and Titzavet, the two Parshia Torah portions that we read last week and we're going to read this week, which are all about God telling Moshe how to build a tabernacle. Then in the Torah portion next Shabbat, not the coming Shabbat, but the one after, Moshe is going to come down the mountain, see the golden calf, break the tablets, and then in the two Parshiot after that, Moshe is going to tell the Jewish people about building the tabernacle. So it's an interesting question. Now Rashi says that it's in the wrong order, and that the whole tabernacle idea came after the worship of the golden calf, as a response to the worship of the golden calf. But not everybody holds that way. Nachmanides, for instance, very famously argues with Rashi. He says, not at all. It's not that the Mishkan, the tabernacle, was responsible for the golden calf. You see people bringing sacrifices in Bereshit. Adam, Jacob. They bring sacrifices. The concept of sacrifices. It was not only a response to the golden calf. There's an argument about that. So how exactly, we observant Jews believe in the divinity of the Torah. How exactly that works, I would not say is at all black and white from. But you're right, it would be a little bit absurd to assume that Moshe got all the narrative, or else could have avoided a lot of problems. Yeah. But there's discussion of this in the moment. Okay. All right, so that is right. So there you have the written tradition with its commentaries, and you have many, many other commentaries that are not in the right. We have commentaries upon the commentaries. We have commentaries that were written way after the Mikra Gedolot. Commentaries. It's an interesting question. Why are those who are chosen to be in that Mikra Gedolot? Why are they in? In other words, why is the rabbi from the 1600 in there? There's 10 other commentaries from the 1600s that are not in there. The Maharal of Prague, the great Rabbi Lowy of Prague, wrote a commentary on Rashi called the Gur Aryeh. That's not in there. I mean, you can only put a certain amount of things in there. The answer is it was probably the decision of printers, right? Once printing came about, printers had tremendous power, right? Why do certain commentaries end up in there? I don't know. I'm not sure that the Jews all agreed on what to put in there, right? Printers put whatever they put in there. So those commentaries get a lot of press. They get a lot of airtime in a way because they're in the Mikrot Gedolot, because they were printed together. Now, obviously, many commentaries are printed separately. Today, incredible amount of printing on the internet, but so we have access to everything. But I would say that Jewish tradition over time bore out which commentaries were very important. Those got more, obviously those are going to get more attention in a way than other commentaries. Or maybe, sometimes it could be the random decision of a printer because he liked a certain thing and that's what ends up getting printed. It takes a lot of power. Could happen. I don't think that's the case with the Talmud. Rashi, I think the printers printed Rashi and Tosafot on the sides. We'll see that in a minute, because those were very important central commentaries. But there were other, the volume, the way the Talmud is laid out the way it is because it was printed in Vilna in the 1500s, and that's what most of us use. But there were other Talmuds that were printed in other places that are laid out slightly differently. The Bamberg Talmud, very famous edition of the Talmud printed in Bamberg by a printer named Bamberg, before what we call the Vilna edition of the Talmud. In other words, in the 1490s, the very beginning of printing, Jews obviously were already printing books. It was so important to us, and so there were editions of the Talmud printed that looked different. There were Talmuds printed, and that doesn't have Rashi. Rashi's in a separate book in that Talmud. Yeah.
So, what impact did the Vilna Gaon have on the Vilna edition of the Talmud? What was or was the Vilna Gaon just a commentator?
Yeah, they're both from Vilna, but I don't think the Vilna Gaon necessarily is connected with the Vilna edition. I think the Vilna edition of Talmud is printed in Vilna, and it was well printed, and that became very popular. This was printed in Venice. He was a Christian. That's right, Daniel Bamberg. It's very interesting. And he employed rabbis and scholars to help him print it. I just actually saw this also. See everything there. Interesting. He included Rashi in that, so he consulted. We printed and make the first road Gedolot also. But again, that one only had Rashi. And let's look up the Vilna. Vilna Shas. Right, Shas means Shisha Sidarim, the 6 orders, because the Mishnah is divided up into 6 major parts, dealing with agriculture, dealing with purity and impurity, dealing with other issues, holidays, right? The Mishnah is divided up into 6 major parts. So sometimes we call the Mishnah or the Talmud Shas, because Shas, Shin Samach, is 2 Hebrew letters. It stands for Shisha. Shin is Shisha, 6. Sidarim, orders, 6 divisions. So science we call that's what it's called here. The Vilna edition of the Shas. But Shas here just means Talmud or Gemara, same thing. Vilna edition of the Talmud, typeset by the Ram and brothers of Vilna. Follows the typical pagination due to Bamberg of printing with the Gemara of the Mishnah centered with Rashi's comments. Oh, it's very late, 1870s. That's it. The Shas weaves is very late. I assume it was better than Bamberg one in terms of maybe being rare. The Steinsaltz, by the way, went back, things were copied by hand for 1,500 years before they were printed. So whatever got printed, but that doesn't mean that that's the most accurate thing, right? Because as you copy things by hand, especially copying thousands and thousands of pages, not like a Torah, where you copy a Torah from another Torah. It has to be done very exactly. And if you come across a mistake, and you're constantly reading it every year, and if you come across a mistake, you have to put it away and use a different Torah. This is a self-correcting process for the 5 books of Moses, for the Torah scroll. That's not true of the Talmud. I mean, the Talmud, right? You have actually commentaries on the Talmudic page. Instance here. You have commentaries on the Talmudic page, which actually their function is to correct or to suggest other readings of the Talmud. In other words, a word might be different in another edition of the Talmud because things got copied by hand. So how do you know what's more accurate? So, for instance, Steinsaltz went back. We found, for instance, in the early 1900s, they found in Egypt something called the Cairo Geniza. There was a synagogue. There's a synagogue in Cairo. It was built in 822. Very old shul. You can go and visit it. It's still standing. And there was an attic in that synagogue where they would throw old books, meaning to bury them. Like every synagogue is very disorganized. Never got around to burying them. Thank God that's true. What you had in there when it was discovered in the early 1900s was basically 1,000 years of old Jewish books that were piled chronologically, from oldest to newest. You have in there books that are in Maimonides' own hand, signed by him. You have it's unbelievable what you have. So and Cairo is extremely dry. It never rains in Egypt, and so there was no bacteria. These books just lasted, whether they were on paper or on vellum or on it didn't matter. Nothing can go. So we have handwritten copies of Talmud from much earlier than printing in places like Cairo Geniza. So you can, that could present a very interesting problem. For instance, what's this?
Yeah, I read, Rabbi, I had heard that Vilna was the center of sort of the intellectual life of Judaism in Europe upon the emergence of Hasidic Judaism, which sort
Wait,
of.
say it again.
I heard that Vilna was the center of Jewish intellectual life when Hasidism, sort of Hasidic Judaism, emerged, which sort of de-emphasized
Yes,
the
that's true.
scholarly aspects.
That's true. And in fact, the Vilna Gaon excommunicated the Hasidim. I mean, we're talking about, late 1700s, early 1800s. Really, we're talking about early 1800s. Not everybody signed that excommunication, but that's true. Vilna was certainly the seat of intellectual Talmud study. And Hasidim were seen as dangerous, taking people away from that, maybe even heretical. That's true. That's also later. I mean, a lot happened in Vilna. It was a center of Jewish life, for 700 years. So thank you for that. It's very interesting. In fact, on the Hebrew University, on the National Library of Israel website, you can see different versions of Talmud from the Cairo Geniza, if you want to compare things. Let's see. It's Hebrew U. Digitized. So it looks like the Kargoniza also is on this. Okay. So, oh. Oh, very good. Oh, they're linking here. Those comes along. The National Library. So, for instance, you can see here Mishnah Tosefta. The Tosefta is right. What's there in Mishnah and Talmud, by the way? Okay, let's look at a simple Mishnah and Talmud. Hebrew box. Shop. Okay. Let's go to the beginning. Okay, so here we go. So this is first page of the Talmud. Brachot, right? Brachot, it means blessings from the book of agriculture. But okay, so you have here a Mishnah. It's called a Mishnah. It starts here and it ends here. You can see these words. Gimel Mem is where Gemara. That's the commentary on the Mishnah, right? The Torah, when the Jewish people got the Torah, they didn't only get the written Torah. They also got an oral tradition that had to keep the Torah. It would be impossible to keep just the written Torah. Now, whether that oral tradition was always translated in words or was translated in actions, one generation would see the previous generation build the sukkahs. They knew how to do that. Probably it was both. Now, when it came to the time of the destruction, the worry was that the oral tradition would be lost. And so it was written down in the Mishnah. These 6 orders of the Mishnah. It was edited well. It was divided up so it could be memorized because there wasn't printing. But the Mishnah doesn't clarify everything. Right? The Mishnah might tell you how to build a sukkah, but it doesn't tell you if you could build a sukkah on a boat. It doesn't tell you if you could use an elephant for a wall of the sukkah. And so the Talmud doesn't tell you how the Mishnah knows what it knows. Right? How does the Mishnah get what it gets in terms of the law from the Torah, from the written Torah itself? Why does the Mishnah use certain phrases that it does rather than other ones? So you have a Mishnah that's like one paragraph here, and then you'll have 5 or 10 pages of Talmudic commentary, Gemara and Talmud, the same Gemara, starting here, and that will go down and on to the next page, and the next page, and the next page, right? And then you have the commentary of Rashi on the side here, and then the commentary of the Tosafot. Rashi died in 1105. He was French. The Tosafot was also French, but lived a little bit later than Rashi. In fact, one of Rashi's grandchildren was part of it. Tosafot is a school of thought. It's a school, like a yeshiva. It wasn't just one person. Here you have later commentaries, right? It goes later and later and later as you get out on the page, because that's how people took notes on pages. This, for instance, is a reference to Maimonides' book of Jewish law and the Shulchan Aruch. So whenever you see a little letter here, that means that's the law. And you want to see where is it in Maimonides or in the Shulchan Aruch, the book of Jewish law. You look here. Other commentary here. The Hagot Habach. This is a different. This is This is a commentary that was written that tells you that there's another version of a line. That you have a line in the Gemara here, and it might be slightly different in another written version. So he doesn't do much here. Instead of a bet, it's a dollar. It doesn't really make much of a difference here. There are places where it could make a bigger difference. And in fact, sometimes Rashi will say, sometimes Tosafot will have a different opinion than Rashi because Rashi had a slightly different version of the Gemara because of a scribal issue. Now, which one's right? We don't know. They both got handed down. But you could, in theory, have a halachic difference based on a scribal difference, scribal error. Right? But you don't know which is the error. Right? You have different traditions. And Judaism tradition is very, very powerful. Now okay. So here, so that was the first page of Brachot. But if you so the Mishnah I mentioned was the codification, written down version of the oral tradition. The Tosefta was like the Mishnah. It's just as authoritative as the Mishnah. It's quoted often by the Talmud, by the Gemara, but it wasn't put into the structure of the Mishnah. The Mishnah was very tightly edited and structured so that you could memorize it, so you had no Jewish law. The Talmud, there are two Talmuds. There's the Babylonian Talmud and the Jerusalem Talmud. One was written in Babylon, one was written in Israel. They're slightly different. The Israeli one is in a slightly different language, a more Hebrew type of Aramaic than the Babylonian one. Babylonian Talmud is usually the one that's studied because it's more extensive than the Jerusalem. But for instance, if we go to Brachot, which we were just looking at, we go to the first page. By the way, Talmud always begins with page 2. There is no page 1, at least in the Vilna edition. I'm not sure about the Bamberg page 2. Let's look at the page. Okay, so very interesting. So here you have Hebrew manuscript. This is from before print. Right, once things start being printed, now they're sort of set in stone. But if you look back, Ketuvei Yad, these are handwritten manuscripts. So for instance, this is Ketav Yad Munich 95, right? That has to do with what library it's in. Here you go. It's in Munich. It's in this library. It's called the Talmud manuscript number 95. Ketiva Ashkenazit, it was written in Germany. Al Pi HaKalafon, 1342. That's when this was copied. It was copied by hand in 1342. It's 577 pages. That's what we have. Where was it found? It was in this library. So let's take a look at that. Let's try better. Okay, so here we go. This is a manuscript of Mishnah, which is in Parma. It's in Italy. It's the Durasi manuscript. Somebody in our class did Durasi. So what year is that? It was written in Italian. In Italy, it was written down in Italy. Hameya Ha-11. So it's a manuscript from the 11th century of the Mishnah. Right? Not with Talmudic commentary, just Mishnah. Oh, here you go. Actually, this. Oh, here. So you can see Me'ematai Koren and Shema Ba'arvim. So it's slightly different, right? From when do we read the Shema? In the evenings. Now the truth is, though, if you look at a Mishnah that we have, it says Ba'arvim with a nun, more of an Aramaic pronunciation. It says Arvim with a mem. Doesn't really make an actual difference, but that's interesting. Right? Whoever was copying that down doesn't mean anything different, but that's the way they copied it. Here it says, Nichnasim lechu b'trumatan, atzofa ashmurot harishona. Ashmurot harishona, until the end of the first watch. That's not what it says here. It says ashmura. This is the Vilna Shas. Ashmura, not ashmurot. Doesn't make that much of a difference, but things are slightly different. Hopefully. Yeah. Obviously, there's probably many other manuscripts in the world. It just happens to be the ones that Hebrew, that the National Library of Israel put on. Now, this is the Talmud. Back to the Talmud, 15th century, 1177, Forenza. This is Talmud. Right, and here you have the Mishnah written down. Although it's interesting, in the Vilna Shas, you have a longer Mishnah and then commentary. Here you have a shorter, the only part of the Mishnah. Right, just this part. Still here. But here you have much longer Mishnah. Commentary. Here you have the Talmud starts right here after only about 5 lines. Talmud starts the same way. Oh, no, sorry, I apologize. It's not. It's the same mission. Same mission. This is part of the same mission. See. But you can see, by the way, where this is a page of Talmud. How is this page of Talmud that was handwritten in the 1100s? How's it different than the Vilna printed edition? Right. It looks very different, right? In the way it's laid out.
Where's like the Rashi and the Tosafos and all that?
Right, it's not there, right? Now, there's a good reason that there's no Tosfos there, which is this was handwritten before Tosfos lived.
Well, that tracks.
Now, Rashi was already around, but it's interesting, right? In other words, it wasn't like the day Rashi wrote it, all of a sudden everybody started copying Talmuds and putting Rashi in. Right? It obviously took a little while until all of a sudden, until people decided that Rashi. Now, I don't know if in manuscript versions of the Talmud there was Rashi. I would bet there wasn't. I'm betting that first time Rashi was on the page, there were separate books of Rashi, I'm sure, but I'm betting the first time Rashi was on the page was probably. Let's see if there was one later. Let's just see if that one from the 1500s. Remember, these are handwritten. So, for instance, here's this is from the 15th century, 1400s. Right? So this is pretty close to printing time. It's about maybe it could be 80 years before printing. But this does not have it, right? Rashi is written 400 years before this. It's written slightly different. It's not written in 2 columns. This is written in 1 column. No Rashi. It's a slightly different hand. Just until the printed edition, it wasn't obvious that Rashi was going to be in there. Now, it doesn't mean people didn't learn Rashi. They did, I'm sure. Rashi was certainly copied by that. Was copied by him. So you can, do some research on your own, play with that. But it's important to realize sometimes, sometimes we just think that what we have is the way it always was exactly, but that's not. Have a good. Any questions before we wrap up? You have some thought. If you have questions next time. Have a good week, everybody. Have a good Adar. It's supposed to be a happy month.